Most stories about Tammy Wynette's final day paint a calm picture. A quiet afternoon, a short rest on the couch, and a peaceful passing. But the more you look at what happened behind that serene image, the more it unravels into something far darker. Her family didn't stay silent because they accepted the official story. They stayed silent because what they discovered afterward raised questions they weren't prepared to face. And as the pieces of those last hours fall into place, it becomes clear that Tammy's exit from this world wasn't as simple as the public was led to believe. It began long before that afternoon, in a battle she had been fighting for decades. What makes Tammy's final hours so unsettling is the fact that her decline didn't start suddenly. It crept up slowly through years of surgeries, chronic illness, and a dependence on medication that kept growing as her pain worsened. And this wasn't the kind of pain that came and went. It followed her everywhere, shaping the way she lived, worked, and trusted the people closest to her. Tammy's body had endured more procedures than most people face in a lifetime. Abdominal surgeries, intestinal complications, recurring infections. Every step added another layer of fragility. To keep functioning, she relied on strong medications, and those medications eventually became the quiet background rhythm of her life. This constant struggle made her vulnerable, not just physically, but emotionally. And that vulnerability set the stage for the relationships and decisions that would play a pivotal role in her final years. Because as her health declined, the people around her gained more influence over how she lived and how she was treated. What came next connected directly to the person who controlled nearly every part of her world. As Tammy grew weaker, her husband, George Ritchie, stepped into a role that went far beyond what most spouses handle. He wasn't just her partner. He was her manager, her gatekeeper, and the person who controlled her schedule, her finances, and even access to her. And while some described him as the one who kept Tammy functioning through her toughest moments, others painted a very different picture. Her daughters later said Ritchie kept her isolated and dependent, controlling who visited, what information reached her, and even the medications she received. These claims were never proven, but the fact that they surfaced at all reveals how complicated Tammy's home life had become. Rumors circulated for years that Tammy didn't have full control over her own choices near the end. Some even whispered that the notorious kidnapping incident from her past was staged to hide a personal conflict. Again, nothing confirmed, but the fact that so many close to her questioned the story shows how much distrust already existed. And that distrust would only grow stronger when her family realized what Tammy had confessed shortly before her death. Something that made her final days even more emotionally tangled. As Tammy's health declined, she opened up more to her daughter Georgette, perhaps sensing she didn't have as much time as she hoped. And in one of those quiet, emotional moments, she finally said something she had avoided admitting for years. That George Jones, the man she married, divorced, fought with, loved, and feared, was still the love of my life. Those words weren't meant for the public. They weren't part of some dramatic performance. They came from someone who knew her time was limited and wanted to finally tell her daughter the truth about her heart. This confession hit like a storm behind closed doors. It cast her marriage to Ritchie in a new, uncomfortable light. It stirred emotions among the people closest to her. And more importantly, it created a sense of urgency, because once a person begins saying things they've kept buried for decades, you never know what else they might reveal next. And that pressure, emotional and otherwise, flowed directly into the strange way her final day unfolded. When the news broke that Tammy Wynette had passed away quietly on her couch, it sounded almost peaceful. The kind of ending people imagine for someone worn down by years of pain. According to the original story, she lay down to rest, drifted into sleep, and never woke up. But that's where the uneasiness begins. Her husband was the one who found her. Her doctor gave the cause quickly, a blood clot in the lungs, and almost immediately, everything moved forward as if the matter was closed. No autopsy, no public questions, no challenges to the narrative. To outsiders, the explanation seemed reasonable. But for her daughters, something felt off. Tammy had lived with serious medical issues for years, but she hadn't been given any warning signs that something like this was imminent. And when they began asking questions, they were met with hesitation, deflection, and a push to move on. Those reactions didn't settle their concerns. They amplified them. And once her family began looking more closely at the circumstances, it wasn't long before they realized they needed to take a step no one expected, challenging the official cause of death and demanding a deeper investigation, which is exactly where the next chapter of this story begins, with a decision that brought the truth, or at least part of it, out of the ground. It didn't take long for Tammy's daughters to realize that the explanations surrounding their mother's death weren't adding up. The more they reviewed her medical history, the medications she took, and the events of that day, the more convinced they became that something had been overlooked or possibly ignored. So they did what few families ever do. They filed a wrongful death suit against both her doctor and Richie, accusing them of mismanaging her care and failing to protect her when she was at her most fragile. This wasn't a small lawsuit. It was a $50 million claim, bold enough to make headlines and force people to pay attention. And as the pressure grew, the family requested something even more intense. Tammy's body had to be exhumed so an independent autopsy could finally reveal what really happened in those final hours. The request was controversial. Richie initially pushed back, insisting an autopsy had never been necessary. But the judge approved it, and what followed reopened every wound the family had tried to heal. The autopsy results didn't solve the mystery, they complicated it. Her heart showed signs of severe strain, and there were medications in her system that raised eyebrows even if they weren't officially labeled harmful. And as her daughters read those results, one thought kept haunting them. If the official explanation had been so simple, why had so many people worked so hard to keep questions from being asked? The results of the autopsy should have brought clarity, but instead they did the opposite. Because the moment the report was released, it showed a picture that didn't match the calm narrative given on the day Tammy passed. The examiner concluded that her heart had been failing, swollen and overworked, something that doesn't strike without warning. Yet Tammy hadn't been told she was facing anything life-threatening. Even more unsettling were the medications in her system. The report listed a sedative and an anti-nausea drug, both familiar to her long medical routine. While the levels weren't officially labeled dangerous, the combination raised questions about how closely she had been monitored, and whether her treatment had been handled with the care someone in her condition required. This was exactly the type of inconsistency her daughters feared. Information that didn't necessarily point to wrongdoing, but hinted that Tammy's fragility may not have been taken seriously enough. And because she lived under the near-total supervision of her husband, the responsibility for what she was given, and when, suddenly became harder to separate from the man who controlled every part of her daily life. The autopsy didn't accuse anyone of anything, but it cracked open a door the family had tried to keep shut for years. And once that door opened, it exposed a much bigger truth. What happened after her death was just as troubled as what happened before it. Once the autopsy sharpened the questions rather than answering them, Tammy's family found themselves pulled into an entirely different conflict, one that had nothing to do with her medical records, and everything to do with what she left behind. Suddenly, attention shifted from how she died to who controlled the life she built. The will became one of the most sensitive topics. Reports later suggested Tammy had made handwritten notes about personal items and who should receive them, but those notes didn't play a major part in the distribution of her belongings. Instead, most of the control reportedly fell into Richie's hands, leaving her daughters feeling pushed aside from their mother's legacy. The lawsuit didn't change that dynamic much, and even after portions of it were resolved, the tension remained. Then something happened that reignited every suspicion. After Richie passed away years later, he was briefly placed in Tammy's crypt and then removed. No official explanation fully satisfied the public curiosity, and though people close to the family offered different accounts, none of them aligned cleanly. Rumors suggest the family felt the arrangement didn't reflect Tammy's wishes. Others say it was a private disagreement. But no matter what version people believe, the removal only added to the long list of unanswered questions surrounding her final years. Through all this, the silence from key places, the estate, some relatives, and those who had once been closest to her, became louder than any rumor. And that silence is what keeps Tammy's story suspended in a space between truth and speculation, where every detail feels like a clue, but none of it forms a complete picture. Looking back at Tammy Wynette's final hours, it becomes clear that the peaceful image the world was given was only a fraction of the real story. Her years of medical battles, the control others had over her daily life, the confession she shared just before her death, the rushed explanation of what happened that afternoon, the lawsuit, the exhumation, the surprising autopsy results, and the turmoil over her estate. All of it creates a portrait of a woman whose last chapter was tangled in far more complexity than fans ever knew. None of the mysteries surrounding her death have been definitively solved, and perhaps they never will be. But the pieces left behind, the contradictions, the secrecy, the quiet tension in her inner circle, suggests that Tammy's final hours carried a weight her family struggled to confront. Maybe that's why they stayed silent. Maybe the truth was too painful, too complicated, or too deeply buried in years of fear, loyalty, and unresolved conflict. What remains is a haunting question that followers of her music still wonder about. Did Tammy Wynette spend her final moments at peace? Or did she leave this world with truths she never had the chance to reveal? And as long as the silence continues, her story will remain one of country music's most unsettling mysteries, a puzzle with just enough pieces visible to hint at something deeper, but never enough to show the whole picture.